For the next 3 weeks in June, we are going to be reminding ourselves of the story of Isaac. And he has a very interesting story because often when the patriarchs are listed, those are those fathers of the faith, Isaac is skipped often in the naming of the fathers. It's Abraham and Jacob, and not Isaac. And so we have titled the series Invisible Patriarch. And this week, we look at his birth. I'm going to start in Genesis 18 and then move to Genesis 21. These are visitors who have come, and they said to Abraham, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And Abraham said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh yes, you did laugh." And then in 21, the Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, "God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." And she said, "Who would have ever said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." The word of the Lord. For this morning, a story. When she woke up that morning, she felt old. She wished there were some loftier feeling she could share, but really, old was how she felt. She was worn, tired, and her body, well, let's be honest, it had seen better days. Had it always been this way, she wondered to herself. It seemed like maybe it had. And yet, there had been a time when she had felt something more. Decades before, Sarah had even dared to believe in a promise. It had come like this voice in her head, except not as just her own voice, as our own voice passes away. This one had lingered with her, the claim of a child one day, a son for her and for Abraham, and even then she'd been doubtful. She was 65 at the time and counting. And yet that voice had continued. That had been years before, and now that initial promise was no more than the faded edge of a memory. She went days, she went whole months without thinking of it, and though she had never become the mother that she thought she might be, Abraham had his promise fulfilled. His promise had been answered. Even now she could see that answer. It was running down the path toward his mother's tent, Ishmael. He was Abraham's son. He was the one that God must have promised so long ago, but Sarah was not his mother. Her own maid, Hagar, had filled the role in her place, and let's be honest, it wasn't the cleanest of decisions. But now Abraham had his son. Now his line would be passed on. There were days, though, that the memories surfaced, days when it was harder to be content with her present reality, and she hated those days. because she felt such bitterness then. She hated that bitterness was allowed to rule so much of her life, and she hated even more that that bitterness found its full measure when she would strike out at Hagar. That maid had never done anything to her. She'd only obeyed her, even to the point of bearing a son for old man Abraham. Yet when Sarah looked at her, all she could see was the joke of her own life. She was married to a man who was supposed to be the father to millions, and yet she was old and she was barren. She'd even changed her name because of that promise. Decades before, she changed her name, and she realized how foolish she'd been, because this slave girl and her son, they would inherit everything. They would have the security of Abraham's wealth. They would have the fulfillment of family. They would have their own promises. That's what it all felt like, a joke. And the joke was on her. Lifting the empty water jug to her head, she left the tent and moved with purpose toward the well, because mornings were the hardest. That was when her whole day lay before her. And those remnants of dreams she'd had the night before, she came to realize were only dreams of a silly, silly woman. By midday, she would have forgotten those morning blues, and she wouldn't think of what might have been about whispered promises so long ago. For now, it was best to keep busy. She was not as spry as she'd once been, so she would need to remain focused to get her work done before the heat of the day. That's what would do it: fire to gather and build, water to pour from the well. That's what she would fill her day with, and it would keep her from having to face the question mark of her life. She realized she was right about the heat and about not being as spry. At 90, the work and the weather affected her more than they ever had before. So when afternoon came, she was glad for a rest, to sit in the shade. But just as she began to cool down, here comes Abraham, rushing at her. There were visitors, he said, 3 of them, and they needed bread, they needed meat, they needed water right now. Abraham was so excited, and he still had a quickness about him, even at 99. It made her remember all that energy he'd had all those years, that energy that had kept them moving from place to place their whole lives because of dreams he'd heard in the stars. What was it that had him going this afternoon, though? Did he know these men? No, he said, strangers. But there seemed to be something more. These strangers seemed to have triggered some kind of memory. She felt it as she peeked at them from behind her tent flap. Whoever they were, they meant the end of rest today. She needed flour and water to make into cakes. And she listened as those men sat and talked about weather conditions and the ability of her husband's animal herd to grow and to earn. At one point, as she was cooking, she thought she heard her own name, but she wasn't sure, because why would Abraham talk to strangers about her? She moved closer to the tent, hoping to hear. And then she heard it again, her name. Her name. She was certain this time. What was going on? She heard one say, in due season? Heard one say, a child? How could he even joke? Did he not know how old she was? Did he not know how long it had been since she could even dream of children? How dare this stranger come and mock her barrenness in her own home? It was hard enough to face her life when these unfulfilled promises, they built up around her, but to have someone come in, talk about her this way, it was too much. He knew how hard it had been, how lost she'd felt. He never would say it. The sadness that had so long been building up in her, it started to bubble out in a laugh. But it was not a laugh of joy. It was a laugh of bitterness. It was a laugh that talked about all that she'd tried so hard to keep at bay. All the emptiness in the past years as she'd watched another woman's child grow up before her. This laugh was not a pretty thing. So she turned to leave, Sarah did. She was not going to listen anymore to these men who brought forth such dark and painful feelings in her. They have no heart. Yet she heard one of the men say this. She heard him say, "Is anything too wonderful for the Lord?" He repeated this promise of a due season, of a set time, of a child coming. How was she supposed to respond? She had once believed that the answer to that most important question was no. No, there is nothing that is too wonderful for the Lord who had adopted them so long ago. But now how would she answer it? These men must be more than they appeared. She could see that clearly now. They knew things. They knew her in a way she couldn't have known. And so she stood there and she panicked. What if I have just laughed in the face of divine messengers? What if I have laughed at angels right before me? So she stepped out of the tent, denying as fast as the words could leave her tongue. And one of them looked at her. His eyes asked the question again, "Is anything too wonderful for the Lord, Sarah?" And a memory from long before began to deepen and broaden in her chest. Could this really be? Could those whispered promises from so long ago be true, not just for Abraham true, but true for her as well? The man said to her, "I heard you laughing, but this I promise is no joke." And with that, a weight within her was gone. She felt free and she felt found. Those walls that she had surrounded herself with for so long that she could never see through or push through, there had been a door there all along. And now that door was wide open and it was calling her into a future that was unknowable, but it still had no question mark. Question mark was gone. Could this really be? She asked herself again, could the Lord actually be this wonderful? And with that, something began to grow inside of her. It began quietly, deep within, and finally it bubbled up and joyfully came out, and what grew within her was laughter.